So thank you, Mark, so much for agreeing to be interviewed. I just want to first start off. I know about what got you into music, into ethnomusicology to begin with.
Uh-huh. Well, I grew up doing classical music, and when I was going to be starting graduate school, uh, I'd had this long interest in studying other cultures. I'd taken classes, about studying other cultures. In fact, I saw there was this class called ethnomusicology, and it was a new field in America then. In 1965, there were not many courses in ethnomusicology in America. And this was at the University of Michigan, and my advisor was really from the first American generation. So I took this, and within a couple of weeks, I said, this is what I want to do. You can study other cultures and do music.
And so what got you particularly interested to Afghanistan?
Well, through circumstances, I had been reading about Central Asia, and I knew Russian actually, and then all the books on in ethnomusicology in the Soviet Union, there were a lot of them on Central Asia. And I thought be a really fascinating place to go, except you couldn't go to the Soviet Union, of course, with a microphone and wander around. And somebody said, oh, the same people live across the border in Afghanistan, and they recently opened for research. I mean, it had really only been a few years that you could go do research in Afghanistan. It was closed until around 1960. And my job as an ethnomusicologist then was to find a country or a place that we didn't know anything about from the music point of view, and to fill in that blank in the map of the world's music. And there was nothing to read about the music of Afghanistan, zero. There were like maybe three, vinyl records and I had no idea what they represented. And that was it. I mean, and there weren't any Afghans in America except foreign students who I met some foreign students who, and they turned out to be friends later. But you really couldn't find out much about that place. So it was very exciting to go to this and just see. I studied Persian at the university, but of course they taught me Tehrani. And coming to Afghanistan, people were saying, "Who are you? Where are you from?" And he's talking this funny Persian.
Yeah. What surprised you the most when you started studying Afghan music? Was it sort of the difference in the dialect, the way that people spoke, or sort of the difference in their ethnicities? Because everyone is a bit, different from each other.
Yeah.
What surprised
Yeah.
you?
Yeah, there are so many different groups. And I chose to work in the North because I was interested in Central Asia. And so I've just been married for a year. I went with my wife. We were so young and like 24 years old. And we just drove. We had this VW Beetle, which is ridiculous for Afghan roads. And but that's what we got. And everybody was so nice. I mean, everybody was so hospitable and so helpful. And the government was encouraging, but they wanted to know where we were, and what we were doing. They'd want us to get in any trouble. At that point, Afghanistan was a great little country with a new constitution and women out in public working, and an openness to the world. So there was American Peace Corps, German Peace Corps, East German Peace Corps, you name it. There was UN development. Everybody was there, and everybody was happy that they were there because they were advancing the country.
And so when you encountered Afghan musicians, what was that interaction like? I mean, you're kind of an outsider, you spoke a different language perhaps, so how did they receive you?
Well, they're always polite. I mean, I got one piece of advice from a guy named Louis Dupree, who was an old anthropologist who'd been around longer than anybody in Afghanistan. The one thing he said was, never ask a question where the answer could be yes, because people will always say yes, because they're very polite. So your answer may not be exactly right,
Yeah.
So that's sort of how it was. So I used my little Persian. If I was talking to Turkmens or Uzbeks, I had to get somebody to help me because not everybody spoke Dari
Hmm.
very well. But we would just arrive in a town because we had to stay in towns. You couldn't stay in villages because who was going to put you up in a village? And in the town, they had a hotel, which maybe didn't have running water, but it was a hotel.
Hmm.
And then you had to go find musicians. And it was hard because people didn't, music had a very low position in the society.
Hmm.
And musicians particularly had a low position. So nobody wanted to admit that they were a musician often.
Yes.
They would say, oh, I don't know if we have any musicians. I said, well, this is a big town. There must be musicians.
Hmm.
But very luckily, you have the Ruza Bazaar on usually Tuesdays and Fridays. And then people came in from villages and they had the Chaykhana, uh,
Hmm.
all men, of course. And then they would be musicians playing for them. And so then I could meet musicians and then I could pay them to come to the hotel and record, or try to interview them. And so it was kind of like that, just, and then word of mouth. So people would say, oh, they'd find me a musician, and, I paid people, so they were happy with that. And,
Hmm. And so
um,
do you think with that, there were certain people who had access to Afghan music versus maybe people who were doing other jobs, like perhaps there was a difference in who had access, who could listen, who was invited to these spaces?
well, I mean, you had private parties, which would have been by invitation, but those are hard to get to, or weddings, and then rarely are you in a place where there happens to be a wedding.
Mhm.
So they had a lot of music in private,
Mhm.
and women sang in private, and but I was in public, so it
Mhm.
was rarely was there really outdoor public music. Nowruz in Mazar-e Sharif, there was a lot of stuff going on because it was a big holiday.
Mhm.
But there were not that many holidays, and music was sort of carefully controlled. What I found eventually in the research was that it wasn't that music itself was so bad, it's that music was one of the activities that were called shauqi. And what
Right,
that
like
meant was
enjoyable and
that
just
they're enjoyable, but then they can be dangerous if you carry too far. Okay, so those things are controlled. So that's like dog fights and partridge fights, and that's like gambling of something. There are things that are okay in small amounts, but you don't want to get addicted, and the people engaged in that, or maybe you don't value them so much.
Mhm.
So I realized that it wasn't so much the way the Taliban talk about it as being a problem with Islam, which is another issue, whether music is good or bad in Islam. But there was more that kind of attitude, I think, than a religious attitude when we were there. Uh,
Mhm. And so when you were in with different ethnicities traveling around, did you find that there was a difference in the way that music sounded amongst different ethnicities? For
sure,
example,
absolutely.
okay, then
People have their own
that's
styles and
mhm.
their own musical instruments, and that's what I got fascinated by.
Mhm.
So overall, generally, in the book that I wrote eventually, in my work, I got interested in what kinds of music were shared by everybody or by two groups or something like that, and which kinds of music were distinctive only to one particular group population.
Mhm.
And I got interested in the dynamics of that, which then the rest of my career, when I did other kinds of research, became a guiding thing for me. What is shared and what is distinctive, and what are the boundaries that music creates or doesn't create, or that music cuts across. The thing that most everybody shared was the radio music. Radio was new. It's
Mhm.
really from the 1950s, and you couldn't hear it in the North until, I don't know, the early 60s, because they didn't have the right broadcast
Mhm.
bandwidth. And um, so everybody listened to that, and it crept into the local music making. So that was something shared. And then you had things that were shared locally. So in the north, in Katahan and Turkestan, the Uzbeks and Tajiks shared a lot of musical uh, style. And so there was a mixture, even the language would be mixed in the songs between Uzbek and Tajik. But the Turkmens didn't share that, for example, and the Pashtuns. So, and there was a small population of Kazakhs, and they weren't, so people had different, there was difference and there was sharing at different levels. And that's basically what I end up thinking about and writing about, in addition to just collecting information. What kind of instruments do they have? How do they look? Like et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the basics of the musical situation.
You talked about scarcity quite a bit and
Yeah,
saying that not a lot is coming into Afghanistan, but also not a lot is going out. So when it comes to something like an instrument, I would imagine in the 60s and 70s, in a remote sort of northern,
yeah,
it wouldn't be difficult to get a guitar. I mean, it was expensive. It was who was going to teach
yeah.
it.
There were no guitars,
Yeah.
period.
So when you were introduced to instruments like the rabab and the
Yeah.
dambura, were you surprised at how simple it was, but how profoundly important those sounds were?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, no question. Yeah, you're right. There wasn't a lot of Rabab. I mean, that's more Pashtun and more Kabul. In the north, it was Damburaz, Rechak. The Tanbur, which maybe came from Kabul, and it's not clear where the Tanbur came from. It's a curious. The Afghan Tanbur is distinctive. It's nothing. It's not like any other instrument in the area, and that one, and then flutes, different kinds of flutes, and then the Jews, what we call a jaw harp,
Mhm.
the changkohus, or whatever they call the chang, which was played by women and children,
Mhm.
and the doira, the drum, which
Yep.
was also mostly played by women, and the zirbahali, which was played by men, the other drum, the pottery drum. Um, those were the, yeah, those were the instruments. And the Kazakhs had their own dutar, and the Uzbeks had their own dutar, which were different from each other, but different from the other ones. And then the dambura was really a good case study for me because there was an Uzbek dambura and a Tajik dambura, and
And there was a difference.
they're built differently. Yeah, they're
Mm.
constructed differently, although the music might overlap.
Mm.
And that I found really interesting, from my point of view,
Mhm.
trying to understand how people think.
Were there moments when you felt that music, Afghan music specifically, revealed something deeper about Afghan society and its identity that maybe words didn't, right? So the sound of a rabab and why that sort of, even today in music, was so familiar and
Oh,
has such
sure.
a,
Oh,
for
sure.
lack of better words, kind of intoxicates you into a certain period.
I mean, that's true everywhere in the world. That's why ethnomusicology is so interesting,
Yeah.
because everywhere you go, music is deep for people, even if they won't admit it.
Mhm.
Even if they don't value it, it's very deep anyway, and they need it.
Mhm.
So sure. There were things I didn't get to see, like the music for Bacha Bozi, because they didn't really want to admit to that tradition, and they didn't want me to see it, and it was more Pashtun anyway. But that
I'm
was
wondering,
going on.
was that an issue? Was it sort of they didn't want you to watch or
Yeah.
listen to it, or sort of the congregation? What was the issue? Because
Well, it was
for lack of
considered,
better word, it exists. We know it exists.
it was understood to be immoral,
Mhm.
or corrupt in some way, and they just didn't want to show it off. And it's because of its relationship to homoeroticism and stuff like that. And so I could get some of those dances. Seeing dance was the hardest thing because dance is more controlled than music in many cultures because it's the body and it's sensual and directly and can lead to sin.
Mhm.
I mean, you see this in the Bible Belt in America, right? They wouldn't let kids dance rock and roll. It was forbidden. I mean, this is not just in Afghanistan. And so dance is a problem. But I was able to get some dancers to come in privately and play for me, dance a little bit for me.
Mhm.
But it was not something I could get access to very easily, unless you were at a wedding and you were, and then it was mostly women,
Mhm.
playing that sort of thing.
Mm. Sounds like there's a lot of secrecy. Is that sort
Yeah.
of normal when it comes to ethnomusicology, or was it just
No, I mean, there are
Afghanistan?
cultures where everything's out in the open, and there are cultures where a lot of things are hidden away. I mean, it's just varies from place in terms of music.
Hmm.
I mean, there are definitely, yeah, it's on a scale, a kind of a spectrum of feeling about music. Um,
So there's a sort of a feeling of we enjoy it, it exists, but you kind of behind closed doors.
yeah, in its place, in its place. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, in
Do you
its
listen
place.
to Afghan music even today?
Well, yeah, I mean, I get nostalgic for that. I mean, I left the last time I was there in 1972. It was just changing. The enormous shift was when the cassette came in, and this
Hmm.
is in the whole world. But in Afghanistan, particularly, nobody had record players. There were only radio stations, and so that meant you were stuck with whatever was given to you to listen to. With a cassette, you can record it yourself
Hmm.
and you can trade it and you can exchange it, and you get control over your traditions.
Hmm.
And that was coming in then. And like I came back for short visits in 71 and 72, and the shift was happening. And there was already the first rock band with those Philippine kids in Kabul, and people were beginning to shift, the mentality about music. And Ahmed Zahir, it was a newer sound. I was used to the older sound of the original Radio Afghanistan Orchestra, and I spent some time in the radio studios and watched them work. But it was still, they had an interesting model of creating a popular music from scratch.
So when you were there during the radio time, listening to it, watching it, how
Yeah,
was that experience like? Were you, uh, I mean, I'm sure they wouldn't have sophisticated equipment at the time. I mean, very few
right.
people did. So how did they sort of come together, congregate, record, and sort of?
Well, in the radio studio, they created an orchestra, and it was very interesting. They brought instruments from all over.
Mhm.
So I worked a lot with a gentleman called Baba Naim, uh, who played the Richak, and he was brought into the orchestra. Representing, he was originally from Badakhshan. You had tanbour, you had the Indian sitar, but they had instruments from the military band. So there were people who had been trained that way, who knew the trumpet. Uh, and maybe the piano. And so it was a hodgepodge of instruments, and they were inventing a style. And a few people that knew how to compose a piece, would teach everybody the piece.
Mhm.
Uh, but the sound was this wonderful blurred sound. The singer, there was one mic. So the singer, it's in front of the singer, and the rest of the sound from behind it is kind of this wash of different instruments. So it's not like, it's picked out with stereo and different, you can hear the different instruments and stuff. It was really a very distinctive sound, that early 60s, mid 60s sound, until they got better, more advanced, studio equipment, I suppose. That was in before the UF cassettes. So it was interesting. The singers were interesting too, because you had some women singing, but they had to hide it from their families. It was dangerous for them. And there's that whole history, which she details very well, of how those women were brought into it. Um, that's pretty fascinating, but that's an urban system. The main style that also they brought in was this kind of Indian music style, Hindustani style, which was very old. In the 19th century, the Afghan kings brought in musicians from Indian side,
Mhm.
and so that was pretty old. So you get that sound um, of an Indian raga sound, which is pretty old in Afghanistan, and were done by people called ustad, right?
Mhm.
Were masters who were designated. And they ran in families, and they lived in the part of Kobo called the Kharabat.
Mhm.
And so that's a whole thing, but that's nothing like what happened in the north, where I was at all.
So
Where it
how
was
was
all,
it in the north? Was it sort of people kind
uh,
of knew who the musicians were? Did they have
yeah,
a specific area? Did they have their own kharabat?
no, I mean there wasn't that level of professionalization at all. I mean, there were amateur musicians too, like in a place like Mazar-e Sharif, some people who would play at home, but they didn't want to didn't want to be known for that, and so it was kind of hard. Occasionally, you could hear an amateur person who would, bring in other musicians and play in private.
So I want to talk a little bit about the ban on music. It's happened before. We saw it, music
The
being
first
banned
Taliban, yeah, yeah,
at the first era of
yeah,
burning music, of burning instruments. Um,
yeah, crazy, crazy.
what was when you first when that happened at the time? What was your reaction? What did you think?
I'm totally horrified. I mean, that they could do that. I mean, to something that people really loved. I mean, but in the first Taliban, it was not so fierce. It looked so bad, but people still did it in private, and somebody would stand out by the street to see if anybody was coming. They still did celebrations, and the Taliban apparently did lots of music in private, but they, of course, would never admit to it. So it sounds to me, although I don't know, but it sounds to me like it wasn't quite as drastic as it is now. Um, they
The
weren't
first time
killing,
around?
yeah, they weren't killing musicians like they are now. Now they seem to be much more embittered about everything, about women and about music than they were back then.
Right.
Uh, but still, it was bad enough. God knows, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
And that sort of also started at the first time around, started a shift where a lot of musicians left, well, had to leave,
yeah,
leaving
of course, yeah,
exile and then sort of creating
yeah,
what they could. But Afghan music still sort of sounded very original, sounded very
sure.
appropriate to its region.
Yeah, particularly then the rhubarb, I think, becomes much more emblematic. And well, I know if you know the work of John Bailey and Veronica Doubleday, because they're still going around the world
Mhm.
playing for Afghan audiences, and people just cry when they hear them sing those
Mhm.
songs because it just means so much to them. And they did go to, I mean, John went to the refugee camp in Pakistan and made that excellent film about refugee musicians. So, they continue to stay with it, stick with it. And also Lorraine Sakata was the other person. That
Mhm.
was the little group of ours.
Mhm.
And she did excellent work and wrote a nice book. And she's the one that digitized, oversaw, managed the digitization of the Radio Afghanistan library, music library,
Mhm.
which is, there's thousands of hours of music that they hid from the Taliban,
Mhm.
which she was able, before they came back, she got all these grants and all this stuff and digitized it. And unfortunately, the Afghan government refused to make copies of those digital files. So we don't know. So there is no other copy abroad. They kept saying, we need a copy abroad for safety in a nice archive and it'll be safe. And they would not do it. And so we don't know the fate of that digitized archive now, whether it's being hidden again or whether anybody managed to make a copy and smuggle it out somewhere. We have no idea. And all that work she put in money.
So
Um,
you're saying thousands of hours of
yeah,
original Radio
yeah,
Afghanistan sound.
broadcast. Yeah, the
It's just
broadcast. We don't know where those copies are now, right? She actually did, first rate digitization, but no, I mean, they wouldn't sign off on it. And everybody was afraid to let the music out.
mm.
Like, what'll happen to our heritage? But so, I don't know what's happened to it.
And so after the post first wave of the Taliban, right? They were gone and sort of this 2010s and
Yeah,
a couple years ago, there was kind of like this burst of music, right? You had television shows, you had music competitions, women
yeah.
were singing on stage, singing in arenas.
Well,
There's
more to the point, some of the stuff that I recorded came back, and they actually used some of my materials because they were online. And
mm,
I saw this Dambulla festival in the north, and there's this big photograph back there, which is one of my photographs. So it's very nice to see that. And then some people wrote me and said, "We want you to know that this music is still being played that you wrote about, and we're
yeah,
happy you did that work." And so that's very nice and rewarding for me.
right. I mean,
Uh,
it goes to show that music, regardless, lives
yeah,
forever, right?
yeah,
It
yeah.
captures the time and lives forever.
Until now.
So speaking of now, it's banned again. We're in the fifth year of music Nothing new is being created,
Right.
no experimentation happening. It's kind of
Yeah.
at a standstill. I mean, even
Yeah.
musicians who are living in exile or who kind of know it from afar, there's nothing new. And sort of a lot of it is just kind of repetitive songs being sung.
Yeah.
Um,
I
what's your
suppose.
take on it now? Like, so how do you
No,
feel?
I don't know. I'm really not in touch. I'm not linked, you know.
Mhm.
But what I like is that young people like you are so interested in the music. I was out last year in Berkeley, and this young Afghan came to see me, and he's been collecting all the cassettes. He's scoured everywhere, and he's digitized them. And he's going to put up. He said he was putting up a website of all of the available hundreds of cassettes he could find. Because I said, "Why are you doing this?" He said, "It's my obligation, you know, to
Mhm.
preserve this." And you know, this is his passion, is to collect and make available all that music. So you know, it becomes an archival project. You know.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So, where do you see the Afghan music heading now? That it's sort of at a standstill, a silence, but what does the
Well, there might be creative work in the diaspora. I mean, still, I mean, young people maybe are going to produce new stuff that will maybe filter back in some clandestine way to Afghanistan. You know, maybe there are ways through the internet that they can get some new ideas back there, you know.
my last question is if you could leave a message for the next generation, right? So Afghans in Afghanistan or those in the diaspora, what do you want them to carry with, what do you want them to carry forward?
Well, they should, since there is so much available from the past, they should know it and cherish it, and then they should do creative work, you know. I just hope that there is someday a break in this. I don't see how, but maybe there'll be some kind of opening again. Of course, the other story is the exile of like the Afghan orchestra and the whole school of music from Kabul. I mean, that's very, very well documented,
Mhm,
and I don't know what's going to happen to those people. I've met some of those people, but how long can they hold together in exile, playing their pieces and touring with it? You know,
mhm,
they have to find other jobs and things. But that
yeah,
was a wonderful, I mean, Ahmad Sarmas, just a wonderful historic figure for Afghanistan. And he wrote the very large study of history of Afghan music, and he created that school, trained all those people. I mean, that's a moment that again becomes kind of historic as a marker for, you know, when they took music seriously at that kind of level, not
mhm.
just as party music or something, you know.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, I hope we get to hear Afghan music
Yeah.
in Afghanistan and around the world.
Right. All right. Very nice to meet you.
You as well. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really
Sure.
appreciate it.